the silence has been broken. John McEnroe, one of tennis's most iconic voices, has finally spoken about coaching Carlos Alcaraz, and what he revealed changes everything we thought we knew about the future of this sport. Just weeks after Alcaraz's shocking split from one Carlos Ferrero, a breakup that sent shockwaves through the tennis world, the seven-time Grand Slam champion opened up in an intimate interview with El País. His words weren't just casual commentary. They were a window into something far more profound. What happens when a living legend recognizes himself in the sport's brightest young star, and what that recognition might mean for the evolution of tennis itself. Because here's what nobody's talking about. McEnroe didn't just say he'd enjoy working with Alcaraz. He revealed something far more vulnerable, far more human. And in doing so, he exposed the psychological dimension of coaching that could define the next decade of men's tennis. Let's rewind to understand why this moment matters so much. When Carlos Alcaraz announced his split from one Carlos Ferrero in December 2025, it wasn't just the end of a coaching partnership. It was the conclusion of a 7-year relationship that had produced 6 Grand Slam titles, 2 year-end #1 rankings, and transformed a talented teenager from Murcia into the youngest man to complete the career Grand Slam. Ferrero wasn't just Alcaraz's coach. He was the architect of his rise, the steady hand that guided him from obscurity to dominance. The split caught everyone off guard. Sources close to the situation revealed significant disagreements between Ferrero and Alcaraz's father about career management. Ferrero himself admitted he wanted to continue, which made it clear this wasn't a mutual parting. According to reports, tensions had been building over contract negotiations, the role of Alcaraz's family in his team, and fundamental philosophical differences about how the young champion should approach his career. Former Brazilian tennis star Fernando Meligeni suggested the split reflected deeper issues about commitment levels, training locations, and lifestyle choices, captured in Alcaraz's Netflix documentary Philosophy of My Way, which prioritized enjoyment alongside excellence. Ferrero, known for his Scandinavian-like sobriety and discipline, reportedly clashed with Alcaraz's more exuberant showmanship and family-centric approach. The coach later expressed his pain publicly, saying he'd poured his soul into the project and felt hurt by how things ended. The fact that Ferrero unfollowed Alcaraz on social media after the Australian Open victory speaks volumes about unresolved emotions beneath the surface. Into this landscape of fractured relationships and uncertain futures steps John McEnroe. But here's where it gets interesting. McEnroe didn't position himself as the technical guru who would fix Alcaraz's backhand or restructure his serve. Instead, he revealed something that cuts to the very heart of what elite tennis actually requires. Those who have heard me comment on the games know that Alcaraz is probably my favorite player, McEnroe told El País. It's crazy what he is capable of doing on a tennis court, and he's not even a particularly tall player. Maybe he's half a centimeter taller than me. That height comparison isn't throwaway banter. It's McEnroe recognizing himself in Alcaraz, seeing the same ability to transcend physical limitations through sheer artistry, the same instinct for impossible angles, the same willingness to attempt shots that make crowds gasp. When McEnroe watches Alcaraz, he sees echoes of his own genius, that same electricity that made tennis more than just a sport. But then McEnroe said something that reveals the real depth of his thinking. Honestly, I would enjoy working with him. All I would do would be to pat them on the back and wish them luck before they jumped on the court. I don't know how far I would really have anything to tell them. Wait, is that humility? Self-deprecation? Or is it the most profound coaching philosophy ever articulated by a tennis legend? Because what McEnroe just described isn't a lack of coaching ability. It's an understanding that at the highest levels of tennis, the technical coaching has already been done. Players like Alcaraz and Jannik Sinner have spent 20 years perfecting their strokes. They don't need someone telling them where their racket should be. What they need is something far more nuanced, far more psychological. And here's where McEnroe's own story becomes impossibly relevant. Throughout his career, McEnroe was tennis's most fascinating psychological case study. As a child, he would burst into tears when he lost, but never lost his temper. Yet as a professional, he became famous for explosive outbursts that defined an era. The "you cannot be serious" moment at Wimbledon in 1981 became one of sport's most iconic scenes. But it was also a window into McEnroe's inner turmoil. In his autobiography, Serious, McEnroe admitted that his temper disrupted his rhythm and often signaled he was about to choke. He saw his anger as a response to nerves and a deep-seated fear of failure. Unlike Jimmy Connors, who diffused tension through humor, McEnroe expressed tension through rage. He openly acknowledged that if he'd been able to remain calm, he would have performed better, a remarkable admission from someone who won 7 Grand Slams. McEnroe's most painful example came at the 1984 French Open final against Ivan Lendl. After his golden year of 42 consecutive match wins, victories at Wimbledon and the US Open, McEnroe led Lendl 2 sets to love in Paris. He was cruising toward completing his career Grand Slam. Then the mental game unraveled. Lendl clawed back, and McEnroe's frustration mounted. His loss of mental composure cost him the title and, arguably, cost him tennis immortality. After 1984, McEnroe never won another Grand Slam singles title. Tennis psychologists have studied McEnroe extensively because he embodied the sport's central paradox: extraordinary talent undermined by mental fragility. He spent more time engaging with the thought stream in his head than most players, and that internal dialogue became both his greatest strength, fueling his competitive fire, and his fatal weakness, disrupting his flow state when it mattered most. McEnroe admitted he never really enjoyed playing competitive tennis, finding the stress and loneliness of the sport hard to bear. Every match was haunted by the fear of losing. Victory brought relief rather than pleasure. This psychological profile, the anxiety, the perfectionism, the emotional volatility, prevented him from reaching what could have been an even more dominant career. So when McEnroe says all he would do is pat Alcaraz on the back, he's not diminishing coaching. He's revealing that he understands exactly what separates good players from immortal ones. And it's not technique. It's the ability to manage the voice in your head. Consider what Alcaraz just accomplished at the Australian Open. Arriving without Ferrero, carrying the weight of their messy split, facing questions about whether he'd made the right decision, Alcaraz didn't just win. He became the youngest man in history to complete the career Grand Slam. He defeated Novak Djokovic in a final that required tactical adjustments mid-match, mental resilience after dropping the first set, and the emotional maturity to handle the pressure of history. Alcaraz later admitted the criticism about splitting with Ferrero created doubts in his mind. That vulnerability, that admission that external voices affected his internal state, is precisely what makes the psychological dimension so crucial. Here's what makes McEnroe's perspective so valuable. He's lived through the consequences of not mastering that mental game. He knows what it's like to have all the talent in the world and still fall short, because your mind betrayed you at critical moments. He's experienced the loneliness of tennis at the highest level, the crushing pressure of expectation, the way one negative thought can cascade into a complete mental breakdown. And he's also seen what happens when players get it right. McEnroe frequently praised Roger Federer's mental composure, describing it as something he wished he'd possessed. He's watched Novak Djokovic somehow maintain championship-level desire into his late 30s through sheer mental fortitude. He knows that the difference between winning 7 Grand Slams and winning 20 isn't physical, it's psychological. When McEnroe describes his potential coaching role as simply providing emotional support, the pat on the back, the reassurance, he's actually describing the most sophisticated form of coaching possible. Because at Alcaraz's level, technical adjustments are minor compared to psychological management. Think about what modern tennis has become. The margins are impossibly thin. Jannik Sinner and Carlos Alcaraz have split the last 8 Grand Slams equally, 4 each. They're both supremely talented, both physically elite, both technically sound. What will separate them over the next decade won't be who has a better forehand. It will be who manages pressure better, who maintains motivation longer, who handles adversity more effectively. And this is where Ferrero's departure becomes psychologically significant. Ferrero provided structure, discipline, and technical excellence. But the reports of tension over lifestyle choices, over Alcaraz's my way philosophy, over the balance between enjoyment and grinding perfection, these suggest a fundamental disconnect about the psychological approach to greatness. Alcaraz has always been different from previous champions. He plays with joy, celebrates with unbridled emotion, embraces the theatrical nature of his sport. His game is built on instinct and creativity rather than systematic perfection. When commentators describe him as a player who attempts impossible shots just to see if they'll work, they're describing someone whose psychology is fundamentally different from the Djokovic-Nadal generation. McEnroe recognizes this because he was the same way. His game was built on feel, on artistry, on the willingness to try shots that seemed irrational. He played serve and volley when everyone else stayed at the baseline. He attempted drop shots from impossible angles. He made tennis beautiful and unpredictable. But McEnroe also knows the dark side of that approach. When you're playing on instinct and emotion, you're vulnerable to psychological swings. When your genius comes from creativity rather than systematic excellence, you need someone who understands how to protect that creativity while managing its vulnerabilities. This is why McEnroe's statement about coaching Alcaraz is so profound. He's essentially saying, I can't make you better technically, but I understand the psychological battlefield you're fighting on because I fought the same war. The role McEnroe describes, emotional support, psychological reinforcement, someone who understands the mental challenges, is actually what elite athletes need most. Sports psychology research consistently shows that at the highest levels, performance is primarily determined by mental factors. Confidence, focus, emotional regulation, stress management, the ability to maintain flow states. These separate champions from runners-up. McEnroe's famous outbursts weren't just entertainment. They were coping mechanisms for overwhelming anxiety. His anger was how he processed the crushing pressure of expectation. Understanding this about himself gives him insight that pure technical coaches can't provide. When McEnroe says he'd enjoy working with Alcaraz or Sinner, he's also revealing something about what he sees in the current generation. He's described them as players who represent today's tennis, a new generation that combines emotion and technical excellence. He sees them maintaining their brave spirit while adapting mentally and technically to situations, competing in what he calls an incredibly intelligent way. This is crucial because the Big Three era, Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, created a mental template for success that might not work for the next generation. Those three developed their games and psychology in an era of slightly slower courts, fewer commercial demands, and less social media scrutiny. Alcaraz and Sinner are operating in a completely different psychological environment. They face constant online commentary, immediate reaction to every performance, commercial expectations that start in their teenage years, and a tennis schedule that demands almost year-round excellence. The mental game has evolved, and perhaps the coaching needs to evolve too. McEnroe also made an interesting point about what coaches provide at this level. For players as good as him, most of the things that are said to them, they already know. As matches progress, they are constantly processing things in their heads. The information they receive from the bench mainly serves to keep them in the right mental state, focused, intense, and prepared for any situation. This perfectly captures the psychological dimension. Coaching at the elite level isn't about teaching forehands. It's about psychological anchoring. It's about being the voice that counters the negative internal dialogue, the presence that provides stability when everything feels chaotic, the perspective that reminds players of their capabilities when doubt creeps in. Consider Alcaraz's recent admission that criticism about the Ferrero split created doubts. That's human vulnerability speaking. Despite being world number one, despite having won 7 Grand Slams by age 22, despite being on track to become one of the greatest players ever, external voices still affected him psychologically. This is precisely where a mentor like McEnroe could be invaluable. Not because he'd fix anything technical, but because he'd understand that psychological vulnerability from experience. There's also something poignant about the timing of McEnroe's comments. He made them right after Alcaraz won the Australian Open without Ferrero, proving he didn't need his former coach to achieve greatness. But Ferrero's subsequent social media distancing, unfollowing Alcaraz after the victory, suggests the emotional complexity of their split. Alcaraz succeeded, but at the cost of a relationship that had defined his professional life. McEnroe understands these complications. Tennis history is filled with player-coach relationships that ended messily despite tremendous success. Tony Nadal eventually stepped away from Rafael's team despite their family connection and historic achievements. Boris Becker and Novak Djokovic parted ways despite winning 6 Grand Slams together. These relationships fracture because the psychological intimacy required for coaching at the highest level creates vulnerability that's difficult to maintain. What McEnroe is offering, even speculatively, is something different. He's not positioning himself as the architect of Alcaraz's game. That work is done. He's positioning himself as someone who understands the psychological complexity of genius, who's experienced both its triumphs and its crushing disappointments, and who might be able to help Alcaraz navigate the mental challenges that will define the next phase of his career. Because here's what everyone's missing. Alcaraz is 22 years old with 7 Grand Slams. If he stays healthy, he could play elite tennis for another decade or more. The physical and technical parts of his game are already at championship level. What will determine whether he wins 25 Grand Slams or 15 won't be his forehand. It will be his mind. Can he maintain motivation through inevitable slumps? Can he handle the pressure of being the favorite at every tournament for the next decade? Can he manage the loneliness that comes with individual sports success? Can he evolve as younger players inevitably challenge him? Can he cope with the commercial demands that will only increase? Can he balance the joy that makes his game special with the grinding discipline that sustained Djokovic and Nadal? These aren't technical questions. They're psychological ones. And McEnroe has lived through all of them. Sometimes successfully, sometimes painfully, but always authentically. The most revealing moment in McEnroe's interview might have been when he compared watching Alcaraz and Sinner at their best to watching the prime versions of Sampras, Nadal, Federer, Djokovic, and himself. That comparison, including himself in that pantheon, shows McEnroe recognizes these young players as potential immortals. And his willingness to even discuss coaching them suggests he wants to be part of protecting and nurturing that potential. "All I can do is enjoy and get excited when I watch them compete," McEnroe said. That statement reveals his genuine love for what these players represent. A new era of tennis that combines the technical excellence of the modern game with the emotional authenticity and creative genius that made his era special. Whether McEnroe actually coaches Alcaraz remains uncertain. Alcaraz currently works with Samuel Lopez, who guided Pablo Carreño Busta to world number 10 and 7 ATP titles. The Australian Open victory suggests that partnership is working. Some analysts have suggested Alcaraz might eventually hire a Grand Slam champion like Roger Federer or Carlos Moya for additional mentorship. But for now, he seems focused on proving he can succeed without a legendary name in his box. But McEnroe's comments have changed the conversation around coaching at the elite level. They've highlighted that the next evolution in tennis coaching might not be about technical innovation or physical training optimization. It might be about psychological mentorship from those who've lived through the mental challenges at the highest level. The split with Ferrero, painful as it was, might ultimately push Alcaraz toward this new model. Reports suggest the breakup wasn't primarily about tennis. It was about management philosophy, family involvement, lifestyle balance, and the emotional dynamics that develop over 7 years of intense collaboration. Sometimes relationships end not because they failed, but because they've served their purpose and both parties need something different. Alcaraz needed Ferrero to transform him from a talented junior into a Grand Slam champion. But becoming one of the all-time greats might require a different kind of support. Less about structure and discipline, more about psychological understanding and emotional intelligence. McEnroe's willingness to even discuss coaching Alcaraz reveals something beautiful about his relationship with tennis. Despite his complicated career, despite his regrets about his own mental game, despite the pain of falling short of his potential, he's still invested in the sport's future. He wants to see players like Alcaraz succeed where he struggled. He wants to share the wisdom gained from his mistakes. That's not just commentary, that's legacy building through mentorship. The truth is, whether or not McEnroe ever formally coaches Alcaraz, this conversation has already changed something fundamental. It's established that the next frontier in tennis excellence isn't physical or technical. It's psychological. It's acknowledged that players who've reached the absolute peak of success might still need help managing the mental complexity of sustained excellence. It's recognized that vulnerability, admitting you need support, acknowledging that external voices create internal doubts, isn't weakness but wisdom. Alcaraz's journey is just beginning. At 22, with the career Grand Slam completed, he's positioned to become one of the greatest players in tennis history. But that journey will require navigating psychological challenges that no amount of technical coaching can solve. It will require finding people who understand the loneliness of individual sports, the crushing weight of expectation, the difficulty of maintaining joy while pursuing perfection. McEnroe knows all of this intimately. His offer, even if it's just hypothetical, is really an offering of hard-earned wisdom, a recognition that genius needs protection, that creativity requires psychological safety, that sustaining excellence demands emotional intelligence. So when John McEnroe breaks his silence on coaching Carlos Alcaraz, he's not just talking about tennis. He's talking about the human dimension of greatness, about what it costs psychologically to be exceptional, about the importance of having people in your corner who understand not just your game, but your mind. And in a sport that's becoming increasingly dominated by mental factors, that understanding might be the most valuable thing any coach can offer. The silence has been broken, and what McEnroe revealed changes everything about how we think about coaching, mentorship, and the psychological requirements of tennis greatness in the modern era.